There's two deeply unquestioned assumptions in science, never questioned. The first is that matter is insentient, that matter doesn't have any awareness whatsoever. That's where things get stuck. That's where the hard problem comes from. We assume that matter has no consciousness whatsoever. And so the problem comes, how does consciousness come into existence then? Well, and here the twist is, the matter that we assume is unconscious is the model of matter which we have in the mind. We don't know what the physical world itself is like. We have this image in the mind of matter, and that's all we ever know. We think that image we have of matter is unconscious. And that's where I think all the problems come from.
In Judeo-Christian thinking, there's the instant of Genesis, when God said, "Let there be light." But in Buddhism, there is no Genesis. Timelessness, no beginning, no end. And how can you reconcile this? Either the universe had a beginning or it didn't. There's no middle ground until now. Now there is a way to combine Buddhism with Judeo-Christian thinking on Genesis. We physicists now believe, though we can't yet prove yet, we believe that there is continual Genesis in an ocean, a timeless ocean of 11-dimensional nirvana.
I'm Dr. Mitchell Gibson. I'm a psychiatrist by profession, but I'm going to retire from that in about a month so I can do teaching full time. And this is my passion, teaching people spirituality and the wonders of human potential. I see some faces from last year, and I see a lot of people that are new. This is a seminar. Actually, this is a talk that is condensed from a 2-day seminar. So we have 115 slides to get through. We won't get through all of them, but we have about 3 hours. I mean, there's going to be a break in there. What we're going to do today is to go over the forces and the dynamics of the spiritual world. And we're going to make some definitions about what the spiritual world is, how it functions, and how we function within it. Because as human beings, we are an integral part of what we would sort of loosely call the spiritual world. It is a real thing. Now, why is a doctor here talking to you about the spiritual world? Well, when I was a kid, and you probably heard this story 100 times, but it's true, I could see things around people, and I could see people that had passed on, and I thought everybody could do that. And so one day I talked with my pastor, who happened to be a fundamentalist Baptist minister, about that. I was 7, and I asked him, why do these dead people hang around their funerals? Why do these spirits walk around? And he told my mom. And I didn't mention it much after that, because I realized that most people couldn't see those things. When I was in the 1st grade, I would sit in my class while the teacher was going over certain things, and I would leave my body and float on the ceiling and look at her upside down. I thought it was funny until I told her about it one day. I've learned since not to talk so much, except in certain groups. I learned that certain things about humanity, most people can't really accept. Most people accept reality the way that we're taught, but reality doesn't necessarily conform itself to rules that we are readily taught in school. As Dr. Michio Kaku was talking about this morning, reality has multiple dimensions. That's been proven.
There's two deeply unquestioned assumptions in science, never questioned. The first is that matter is insentient, that matter doesn't have any awareness.
And that those dimensions have a reality outside of our physical understanding. Well, today we're going to go into a fair amount of detail about what's known about that physical understanding of the spiritual world and how we can use it to help evolve ourselves. The spiritual world is somewhat different than what you might suspect. It's not just a world where ghosts or spirits walk around all day in white robes and kind of just chill and wait for their next life. It's a much more robust and, how shall I say, active place, dynamic place than the physical world. The physical world, in my own personal research and in my own reading and training, is a place that is derived from the spiritual world. So we're going to answer some basic questions at the beginning and set up the discussion or the presentation so that we have some clear definitions about what we're going to be talking about. First question is, what is the spiritual world? We're going to answer that shortly. How does it differ from the physical world? We're also going to answer that shortly. And an important question, which is not just for shamans or magicians or people who are in spirituality, how do you get there? What is the significance of talking about the spiritual world for everyday people? We're also going to start with a general theory, a theory you may or may not have heard in some detail in the past. Human beings in this theory, and it's a general theory of how we can meld the spiritual world and the physical world together. The theory is human beings descended from a primordial state of energy. Primordial means unformed or undescended into matter. The second condition of this theory is that the present condition of the human body is a transitional condition that is a complex of energy and matter. The human body is not the solid thing we think it is. Actually, one of the amazing things about particle physics is that we haven't discovered any solid particles yet. And that human beings, everything that we see is not solid. When we touch ourselves, when we touch a rock or sand or eat food, it feels solid. But that's a very convincing illusion. That's not real. Every atom we ever looked at can be split. And you keep splitting it, and it gets down to the point where it's just energy. And the human body is no exception to that. The human body, as a matter of fact, we're going to go over some remarkable slides, can be made to return to a state of pure energy while a person is still alive. And there's been some research to show that, and there's been a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, that have done that consciously. This isn't just something that is a mathematical construct or mystical theoretical discussion. This is something that happens. This is something that happens on what you would almost call a regular basis. The vast majority of humanity in this general theory still exists in a state of energy, undescended into matter. And humans still exist in what we call, in the physical form, are only a small fraction of human beings. And that primordial humans are all around us. Now you might ask, well, I can't see them, I can't touch them. Well, you might ask the same question of bacteria. You can't see them, you can't touch them, but they outnumber humans billions to one. Primordial humans are the same. Their true home is the spiritual world, and that's the world we're going to be discussing. These primordial humans, humans that live in a different state than you and I, have a different energy density than we do. We might call them spirits. They also present themselves as luminous beings. I'm going to go over some discussion about what that is. They can take a variety of shapes and forms. Also, some of these primordial humans are a lot smarter than we are. They have greater intelligence and greater mastery over reality. Also, these primordial humans live in what physical humans call the spiritual world. So the interface between physical humans, us, and primordial humans, which are humans that are undescended into matter, is called the spiritual world. We're going to look at several clues as to why this theory was generated. And we're going to take clues from several areas. The first clue we're going to look at are clues from the ancient world. Now, a lot of people, when we were growing up, we thought that people a long time ago were very primitive. We thought that they didn't know anything compared to you and I. And actually, that's far from the truth. In many cases, primitive people, ancient people, are not primitive at all. They're a lot more intelligent, a lot more advanced than we are. Also, we have clues from the modern world. There is evidence from the modern world that the spiritual world and the human physical world are not that dissimilar, that there's an interface that we're just beginning to understand and to see. Also, we have clues from the world of science, which shows that the scientific model of reality in physics is showing that the world is not made of matter. The world is made of something entirely different than what we thought, which fits more into a mystical, sort of philosophical model of reality than what we had originally thought. Also, we can get clues from the world's great religions, spirituality, general spirituality, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. All the major religions talk about an energy matter interface between physical humans and spiritual or primordial humans that we can only begin just now to understand. Also, there's some pictorial evidence from photographs that we can point to. And also there are ancient and modern spiritual practices that we can use, physical humans can use, to transform ourselves into something far beyond the physical state. Let's start with the ancient world. In the ancient world, Tibetan Buddhists taught that by looking at this letter, which is the Tibetan letter for A, is pronounced allowed humans to regain contact with the primordial form from which we are all descended. They teach that there's a primordial energy form that all humans are in the physical body descend from, and that the body can be contacted through a special meditation with this letter. Also in the ancient world, there are legends. Some of these legends are actually not legends, but true stories that have been handed down as recitations or oral teachings that talk about a number of ancient spiritual masters who have dissolved their physical bodies into pure energy. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay. And most of these exercises are techniques that have to be applied over a series of years, though a few of them are instantaneous. But there are a number of these exercises that can be taught and are being taught in present modern day times that allow a person to be transformed back into energy and to go back and forth. The overall result of these exercises is to change the physical body into something that is not physical, something that is energetic. Let's talk about some names of particular people who have done this. There's a man by the name, an ancient master by the name of Jampil Shinyan, who lived in Bodhgaya, India, who transformed his body completely into light. This was about the 1500s. And there's another great master by the name of Sri Singha, who transformed his body near the cremation grounds of Celia in central China. And there was another one, Vimala Mitra, who transformed his body in Kashmir. And Janasutra transformed his body near the Basing cremation grounds in northern India. Now, they would perform this while they're still alive. So these teachings about these masters have actually been handed down for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so you might say that sounds like something that is a myth or a legend only, but there's more to support that. In the modern world, people disappear every day, just in the thin air. It's estimated that each year in the US alone, over 10 million people just disappear. Now, you could obviously argue that over 95% of these might be accounted for by crime or people just wanting not to be found or abductions. But it's estimated in Newsweek magazine that over 800,000 of these people never come back. They're just not accounted for. And that not all of these disappearances can be explained so easily. So when you look at the numbers, let's say that even a fraction of this is true. Let's say that even 1,000 people disappear. There's something going on there that we can get some more clues about. In the year 1815, in a Prussian prison, there was a prisoner by the name of Durerci who was sentenced for assuming his employer's identity. He was sent to jail. And one afternoon, this prisoner was chained together with a number of other prisoners. And they were walking in the prison yard for exercise. And shackled together with other prisoners, this person just slowly began to fade into nothingness. This is a documented case, and disappeared in the middle of nowhere. His body became more and more transparent and disappeared altogether, so that only his manacles and leg irons were left. He was never seen again. And this was a documented case from the Anecdotal History of Missing Persons by J. Robert Nash. Not that this happens every day, but once in a while it does. Yes?
Did his clothes disappear too?
Everything disappeared but his manacles and leg irons. This is another case from the modern world about a man named James Warson in England. And this man was a shoemaker. And he made a bet with some friends, just to summarize this slide, that he could run 16 miles without stopping. Well, his friends were following him in a horse cart and just watching him. And they saw him as he was running fall forward. And he never hit the ground. His body just disappeared. Clothes, everything. He completely vanished. They got the police involved in the investigation. He never showed up anywhere. And this is from a fascinating book by the name of Into Thin Air, which documents a number of these cases of people going into another world that we don't fully yet understand, by Paul Begg. There was a British diplomat who was a high-level official in the British government that disappeared into thin air in front of people in 1809. He had stopped for dinner and stepped in front of his coach to examine his horses, and he simply disappeared without a trace, just gone for no reason. Now, this doesn't just happen to one person or one individual. I'm sure you all have heard of cases where entire villages or ships will disappear. And they have to be going somewhere. So we're going to talk about possibly where they're going. In November 1930, so this was a somewhat more recent case, in a village in northern Canada, a trapper by the name of Joe LaBelle went into a community of about 2,000 residents, and there was nobody there. There was still food that had been left. The dogs had been left, but the dogs had starved to death. And nobody ever found any of the people, no bodies, nothing. There was no traces in the snow or anything. It gets weirder. There's a story in 1915 during World War I where an entire battalion of soldiers was witnessed disappearing. And this was a famous case where 3 soldiers saw an entire battalion of English soldiers that marched and never came back out. The battalion was assumed to be kidnapped or taken prisoner by the Turkish government. Britain demanded that they be released. Nobody ever saw them again. Now, it's possible that this was a UFO. It's possible that it's something a little bit weirder. So let's look at the world of science. In the world of science, science has now pretty much proven that 96% of the universe can't be seen. That when you look at a room like this, when you look up through a telescope, when you look up in the sky, that 96% of what's there, you can't see it. The best estimates of what the universe is made up of anyway, like Dr. Kaku said, is something called dark energy or dark matter. We can't see it, but it accounts for more than 96+% of the universe's matter. It's also the most common thing that is in existence. Dark matter is not made of protons, electrons, or neutrons. So when you look at your body, 96% of your body is not protons, electrons, and neutrons. Your body is an unstable matrix of something we're only beginning to understand. Well, oddly enough, the world's great religions have already anticipated this discovery. They say that there's something in the body, the physical body, that the physical body is moving toward. That the physical body is not just something that is going to live, be fed, and die one day, and that's it. That there's sort of a higher purpose for what we are as physical beings. In Christianity, they call that the resurrection body. In Hinduism, it's referred to as the Vajra body. In Buddhism, they call it the Buddha body. In Tibetan Buddhism, they call it the Jalus. And we'll refer to that a little bit later. And in Indonesian Islam, they call it the body of light. And in Islam in general, it's called the diamond body. But as you can see, in most of the world's greater religions or major religions, there's already an anticipation that something greater is in store for the human body rather than just death. And that the true home of the human body is not the physical world. That the physical world is only a temporary place that the human body lives on its way to somewhere else. Now let's look at some interesting cases here. This is a picture that a patient gave me. And this is a picture, if you look at it closely, shows a being that is floating above what looks like a mantle or something near the door. And this is a picture that was taken shortly after the death of a lady in the family. And this being stayed and talked with this family for 6 hours. The being said that it was from another dimension that was made out of a different sort of matter, and it had come to collect the soul of the lady who had just died. I asked the family members not to turn this picture in, not to do anything with it, because I felt that they would get the wrong sort of publicity for it. And so they haven't. But if you look at this picture, you can see a being that looks like a butterfly. And it has, if you look at it closely, it has a human head. The head, when you blow this up, has eyes, he has a mustache, he has blonde hair. And it's sort of weird because I'd never seen anything quite like that. So it points to, and these are very simple people. These are not people that would go around with very sophisticated technology to make something like this up. The lady that showed me this was in tears. She wanted to have some sort of explanation. This is another picture that was sent to me, and some of you might have seen this. This was taken during a transatlantic flight. And the plane went into difficulty, and the pilot announced that they were going to crash land because the plane had taken a nosedive. And one man on board decided to take a photograph. Now, the plane's crashing. He's got his camera out snapping pictures. Sort of an unusual presence of mind, I would say. And the plane suddenly just leveled off. And everybody was saved. When the man took the picture outside, he said that he saw something like an angel in the clouds. And the angel had extended his hand over the plane, and the plane was saved. And this photo was provided by a man from Holland who had witnessed this and had developed the picture. If you look at the picture, you can see something that looks like a man with a robe, and you can see sort of like a sash around the robe. And that's not something that you would expect during a plane crash. It was just something that was not planned in any way. It seems like there's another dimensional sort of energy going on there, another form of matter that's interacting with our physical matter in a way that we can't account for with our physical laws. This is another picture. I specialize in forensic psychiatry, which is the type of psychiatry that deals with accidents, injury, and illness that don't lead to death. When it leads to death, it's called forensic pathology. Now, this is a picture from a car accident. If you look at that car, you would think that nobody would walk away from that. But the occupant said that they saw a being floating in front of the car before the accident, and they walked away both without a scratch. Now, this picture was taken by a police photographer who said that he also saw this. Again, you see an energetic sort of being, a being that is not physical, obviously, but obviously there's a form of matter there that we're not fully able to explain with our physical laws. There's something else going on there. Now, everybody has heard of luminous balls of light or orbs. This is a picture that was taken, I think it was about 5 years ago, above a cemetery. And this person that took the picture saw these luminous balls of light. There's a very famous author by the name of Brad Steiger who took a survey of over 20,000 people. And in his survey, he talked to people who believed they had experienced something supernatural. 37% believed that they had experienced a light being, and 38% that believed that they had experienced an angel. Millions of people have taken pictures of these luminous balls. So let's talk about what this might be. This is another picture taken in someone's backyard of these luminous balls, and this person actually saw them. When you look at these balls, you see sort of a matter or cell-like structure inside of it, and you see them just floating around the background in there. This is another picture, and you see the balls in different colors and different shapes and different sizes, and literally millions of people have taken pictures like this, and people really don't understand what that is. So the question comes up, according to the theory, is this a picture of a different type of human being? This is a picture of primordial humans undescended into matter. Is this a picture of a different state of matter that we don't fully understand? This is another picture taken, again, near a cemetery and in a backyard, and literally billions of these things have been photographed. And the first thing you would think, well, these people have dirty cameras. There's something wrong with these cameras, but not all of them can be accounted for like that. So let's talk about some physical modern techniques that might begin to explain why all of these different forms of matter, these pictures, these beings that look like angels, these luminous balls of light, let's try to make some sense out of what this might be by looking at one particular technique and one particular case, which will lead us directly into a discussion about the spiritual world. The rainbow body, or the jalouse, can be generated by something called the Tricode practice. The Tricode practice is a specific form of Tibetan Buddhism where one's physical body is dissolved intentionally into the subatomic constituents that make up the body, leaving only the hair and nails behind. Has anybody heard of this before? Okay. Actually, it is. Say that again?
I thought it was Tregale, not Trek Show. Trek Show, you don't gain the rainbow body.
Actually,
it's Tregale.
Okay. The process generally takes about 7 days where the body progressively shrinks in size. And there's a very famous modern case where this happened. This is a man by the name of Khenpo Achos, who died in the summer of 1998, which is actually relatively recently. And he died without any signs of old age or illness. After extensive training in, never been sure how to pronounce that word. Does anybody know? Nyingma? And this word? Gelug, okay. These are schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and he was known for teaching the toughest bandits in that community these forms of Buddhism. He had lived almost a monastic form of life, and he retreated into a small village and began to practice mantras and visualizations. And people began to say that he would generate light and energy and perform miracles in his area. About a year before he died, a Rinpoche advised him to have a thangka painted of Ganden. Has anybody heard of the Ganden before? Ganden is one of the heavens in Tibetan Buddhism, where a person lives immediately around the time where they become a Buddha or a Maitreya, which is a form of world savior. So it's it's called the heaven of contentment. Khenpo began to change right before the time that he died. The week before he died, a rainbow appeared over his house. And this was documented by a Stanford professor who was also a priest, Brother Francis Tissot. And this was documented and written up in a number of journals. I think the most common one was the International Institute of Subtle Energy and also the Journal for Gnosis. Francis Tissot, Brother Tissot, said that he saw the wrinkles on this man's skin disappear and that his skin became like that of a very young boy. Another of his disciples said that his skin actually became luminous, but Brother Francis said that he actually saw the skin release light. Everyone present noticed a sort of sweet fragrance and that they saw rainbows fill the sky. They also heard something that sounded like music but they couldn't make out the words in the area that this man was passing. A lama, after his passing, his immediate passing, a lama told Khenpo's disciples to cover his body with a yellow cloth and not to touch it. The disciples could see through the cloth and they saw that his body was shrinking. But there was no sign of any decomposition, no insects, no smell, and the weather was warm outside. On the 8th day, they looked in the box that they had stored his body, and there was no body at all. His body had completely vanished. All they found was his clothing, actually the cloth, and there were no marks on his clothing at all. And they found something else. This was all that remained of his body. And it's one of the reasons they call it the rainbow body. One of the things that happened to the Buddha when he passed is that they had difficulty cremating his body. And they say that many of the relics that were left as a result of Buddha transforming. This man, Khenpo, said that he had distilled his body down to the direct essence of what his body was made of, as a direct result of the practice that he had talked about. Well, when you look into this phenomena, which was somewhat fascinating to me, you find that he's not alone, that this is something that happens fairly frequently. This is an area of Tibet called the Sacred Dzogchen Natural Mountain Caves area. And this is about 7,000 meters up, which is over 20,000 feet, pretty high up in the area. And this is an area where many of the world's practitioners, or the most enlightened practitioners, go to achieve enlightenment, but not only to look for enlightenment. They also go to particular caves, this one particularly. And in this particular cave, in the Right Canyon area, there have been many yogis in the Dzogchen tradition who transform their bodies directly from this cave into light or into energy. This is called the solitary retreat practice, and they say that it is the fastest way to achieve enlightenment in one single lifetime. It costs $25 a month to maintain this cave, and in 1959, the Tibetan government went to great lengths to destroy most of these, which I thought was a shame. Now, this lineage is something that has been going on for quite some time. This has been going on for a number of years. The Holy Dzogchen area is a natural sacred land, and there have been many supernatural beings who still appear here on a regular basis. It's a place of great pilgrimage in the Far East. And many of the practitioners who go here experience the Buddha, they experience a number of bodhisattvas, they still experience a number of beings who have enlightened and moved on to this spiritual world dimension. And they call it a place of miracles. They say that this particular area, which is between the Siltram Snow Mountains and the Rudam Canyon, is a place where many miracles still occur every day. So it's a place of great pilgrimage that most Americans don't know about. So in modern times, there have actually been a number of other people who have done this transformation that is not well written about in our country. Another person went to the Holy Dzogchen area and met Vimalamatra, who was one of the masters who had died, well, actually who had transformed himself into a body of light hundreds of years before. He meditated after receiving this special energy from this being Vimalamatra. And in 1958, he was taken to prison by the Chinese army. As he was being taken to prison, and this is a very famous case, he began to fly into the air and disappeared in front of everybody's view. And he transformed into light in front of the Chinese army. And another very similar case, this is another man, Sonam Namgyal, who is probably one of the most famous cases, was also practicing the Dzogchen tradition and attained the rainbow body in front of thousands of people, just in front of people who were watching him do this. He did it in particular in public. And to date, more than 100,000 people have transformed themselves using this technique and this tradition into what we call a rainbow body. These people in this tradition have changed themselves from physical matter purposely into a different form, which is something that in our Western mind doesn't really sound possible. This is a man who is a very interesting human being. His name is Prince Ratu Pandiji Pandita. He is descended from a line of kings that is unbroken for 12 generations. He is also descended from a man who transformed himself into a body of light in 1663 in front of his entire court. This man is recognized, the Prince Pandita, as a direct emanation of his great, 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 etc. grandfather, Prince Pandiji Sakti. And he is one of the ruling families in Indonesia at this time. He is also recognized as a Maitreya, or a direct emanation. Anybody know what a direct emanation is? Now, this is a man who transformed himself into light. So why is he back? How does that occur? Yes. Just one second.
He's an incarnation to come back as a bodhisattva,
Okay.
to decided to take back the physical form to continue the teachings.
A direct emanation is somewhat different than a direct incarnation. An emanation occurs when a being who is transformed will become enlightened, decides to come back for a specific purpose. This man's purpose is to come back and teach people how to transform themselves. This is what he teaches. And he's been recognized as a master in doing this. So let's look at our general theory. There exists some evidence that points to a certain primordial lineage of human beings. The human beings can transform themselves into something that's beyond just the physical body, and that this matrix can be transcended by certain techniques, and that there is a spiritual world that once a human transforms, that they can potentially go into this world and live in a certain higher reality. So what is this spiritual world? What are the forces that govern this spiritual world? And how can human beings take advantage of these forces? And how may the primordial state be achieved by ordinary physical human beings? Now, one of the reasons I'm interested in this research is because I had contact when I was a resident with one of these primordial beings. And I wrote about it in a book called The Living Soul. And in the book, I describe a story. And in the story, I talk about my contact with a being who called himself Dejanti. I'd never heard that word before. And I was a second-year resident in psychiatry. And in your psychiatry residency, you stay up anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week doing what we call being on call. And when you're on call, you can go in on a Monday and not go home and get any sleep until Wednesday. And so I thought that I was hallucinating out of being fatigued and just not being, getting enough sleep and getting enough rest. One of the things that happened during my contact with this being is I learned that it being had another name. The other name this being had was Thoth. Has everybody heard that name before? T-H-O-T-H? Now, as a doctor, I had a lot of trouble with talking with beings from other dimensions. As a psychiatrist, I couldn't really discuss it with my colleagues. But there were some patients I could talk to about. There's one story I write about in the book about a man. I was on call one night. His name was, it was not his real name, but I called him Mr. Lanazuki. And Mr. Lanazuki was manic depressive. And we had admitted him because he had run from Germantown, Philadelphia, down to Central Philly, which is about 20 miles. But he did this in his boxer shorts and no shoes. And this was in the dead of winter in Philadelphia. So this is not something an old man in his 80s you would think would be able to do. But he did it. And the police brought him in, and he didn't stop running around for an hour or so by the time I saw him. But when I saw him, he said, "Doc, who is that glowing guy in the corner there? Big bald guy." I thought, is he seeing the same thing I'm seeing? And so he said, "Oh, he looks like you a little bit too." Okay. So we had a conversation about my personal hallucination, which was no longer my personal hallucination. And grudgingly, over time, I had a lot of other experiences like this that began to show me that there's something to our universe, to our reality, that is higher than our world. That there are beings who are more intelligent than we are, beings that we don't write about in Harrison's textbook of medicine, or the DSM-3 or DSM-4, that have a great deal to teach us. So a lot of what I learned about the spiritual world came from my interaction with this being, which sounds a bit shamanic for lack of a better term, but that's what happened. And I waited 20 years to write about this for obvious reasons. I like practicing medicine. But I'm retiring next month, so I could talk about it as much as I like. There are forces that govern the spiritual world. There are also ways that human beings can take advantage of these forces and begin to evolve. One of the things that sort of got my attention as I was learning from this being is that the human body is quite different than what we think it is. One of the things I learned in genetics, that if you took all the DNA in one person, and this is basic molecular genetics, and you turned all that information into book form, the books that that information would generate would fill up the Grand Canyon more than 75 times. That's a great deal of information for every one of us sitting here. Why is there so much information? The interesting thing about that is if you took all your DNA in one body and strung it end to end, it would go to the moon 500,000 times. Now, the really interesting thing about that is that we don't use most of our DNA. Most of our DNA just sits there. Actually, 97% of our DNA is totally unaccounted for by modern science. When you look at the human body, only about 2 to 3% of our DNA codes for every protein, every muscle, every enzyme, everything that we do. The rest of it has no known function at all, of any kind. They call it junk DNA. And there's actually two names for it. When you look at the physical body, sDNA, or silent DNA, is 97% of your body. It just sits there. It's silent, doesn't do anything. pDNA, or physical DNA, is anywhere from 1 to 3% in most people, which scientists find somewhat strange. Why would there be so much space? What is there about human DNA that we don't know that's generating all of this information? So, some interesting parallels come up when you look at human potential, when you look at human DNA, and when you look at the universe. We don't use 96% of our DNA. We also don't see 96% of the universe. There might be a connection there, if you look at it. And it's somewhat embarrassing because scientists now have to admit that 96% of the universe is totally beyond our comprehension. It would appear that the universe is made up of some unseen mass that we can't see and that we can't understand. But something in our physical body is already pre-wired to interact with that. There's an astronomer at the Department of Astronomy at the University of Washington that said that we can't find 90% of the universe. It's just not available. And there's another scientist who says that dark matter is Mother Nature having a double laugh at us. That it's not something we can fully understand. That most of what we see in the universe is hidden. But ancient philosophers, Hindu, Druids, Kabbalists, Buddhists, etc., have written for centuries that the missing mass of the universe, this missing part, is called the spiritual world. And we're going to go into a lot of detail about what this world is. Where is it? Let's start with that. physical world is still in the process of being created. There are people that are being born every day. There are plants that are being created every day. Everything in the physical world comes from something that pre-existed before it. If you put a seed in the ground, you can get an oak tree from that seed, but the oak tree obviously doesn't fit inside the seed. The tree can be 50 feet tall. The seed can only be maybe a half inch or so. It's coming from somewhere. For lack of a better term, let's call that place source. Now, this is an important slide. And we're going to break the dimensions down. We're just going to deal with the first 9 dimensions of reality. And this is a basic outline for the rest of our discussion on the spiritual world. The first dimension that we're going to deal with has to do with what we call the 9th dimension. And this is the dimension where what we would call God exists. Now, as humans, it's very difficult for us to understand the concept of God. The 9th dimension is the highest dimension that as humans we can begin to understand and put into words or a physical concept. Actually, not physical, but some sort of theosophical, let's call it theosophical construct. Then the dimensions emerge from this Godhead in a spiral fashion. What's interesting about that is that DNA is also in a spiral fashion, an interlocking double helix, actually. And according to most cosmologists, the universe emerges from the inner world outward, and that we're kind of in the bad neighborhood part of the universe in the 3rd dimension. We're way down here in the 3rd dimension. There are forces that interact or that act on the physical world that create the universe as we know it around us. These forces have names. And in spiritual research, which most of us probably haven't heard much about, these forces have been defined, they've been categorized, and there have been uses that have been applied for these particular forces that have been applied in meditation techniques. And in spiritual research, which most of us probably haven't heard much about, these forces have been defined, they've been categorized, and there have been uses that have been applied for these particular forces that have been applied in meditation techniques. We're going to talk about some of those techniques in a moment. The first force that acted upon the universe is called the A factor. What do you think that first force does? Just as a guess. Anybody want to guess? Now, this is what we would call God, and this is the first force acting to emerge what we would call reality in the form of the 8th dimension. What would this A factor force do? What does it do? Anybody want to take a guess? Raise your hand so we can use the mic.
Vibrate, make sound.
That's true. It does vibrate. What else does it do?
Could it be light?
It is light, that's right, but it has a very particular purpose that still acts on us today.
Create.
It does create, but what particularly does it create?
Well, I wasn't going to say what it was going to create. I was just saying its function was to expand.
Okay, that's very good. All of those answers are correct to a certain extent. A factor has one job. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Matter?
It does help create matter, that's right. Were there any other before I go into?
Catalyst?
It is a catalyst. That's warm. That's very warm. You want to go ahead with that? I do this to my students all the time.
Catalyst that infuses energy with purpose.
Okay. That's getting there.
Luminosity, radiance.
Let me go ahead and give to you. Okay. That's close. The purpose of A factor is to separate humanity or to separate reality from what we call God. It's called the factor of the first propagation. It separates everything that exists from what we call the state of non-existence or God. God would be, in our terms of discussion here, the term or the sum of all potentials. The A factor causes things to be created in their original primordial form. That's what A factor does. An A factor acts through all the different dimensions. It causes a person to say, I am. I am Mitchell, I am a plant, I am an animal, I'm a fish, I'm a tree, etc., etc. It causes beings to want to express themselves in form. Before that, all things are formless. The purpose of the A factor is to give reality a form, a way that it can experience itself and experience the universe. Now I'll give you B factor because that one's just too hard to guess. B factor acts on the fifth dimension for one particular purpose. B factor is a universal force that causes energy in the fifth dimension to be returned back to the ninth dimension or God. It's called, it's not the same as the A factor because the A factor has one goal. The A factor wants to push everything as far away from God as it can. But the B factor wants to turn things back to God. It's also called the immortality factor. It wants to make things immortal. The next factor is called the X factor. The X factor acts on the third dimension, which is where we live, to place things in the fifth dimension. Now, this is the source of a lot of the meditation practices that we just talked about that take advantage of this X force or X factor that exists inside of all of us. Every one of us have this. It's called, another word for it in our Western society, you might also call it the Christ force. Now, this force has one particular purpose. What do you think that purpose is if you call it the Christ force? Raise your hand.
Enlightenment.
Enlightenment, but something more than just enlightenment.
Transformation?
Transformation into what? We go back to our...
Primordial state.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Very good. The X factor exists in all of us. You can measure it using certain techniques. The X factor has one goal. The X factor takes the 97% of our DNA and turns it into a light body. That's what the X factor does. That's its function. All of us walk around with the X factor being dormant inside of our bodies all the time. There are specific meditation techniques that have been devised over centuries to take advantage of that dormant state or that dormant force. There's another factor called Z factor that has a different sort of force or different sort of action. Z factor is another term for death or chaos. The Z factor has one goal, and the Z factor's goal is to make sure that when you live a life, it makes sure that your body gets dissolved back into matter or back into the constituent parts of reality that created it. The Z factor also causes death and aging and illness. Were there any particular questions about that before we go on? Yes. Raise your hand, just a second.
Do you make any correlations with those 9 factors and the 3 kayas?
With the 3 kayas?
Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya.
You want to explain that to the group?
Well, it's a Tibetan tradition. There are 3 Dharmakaya being pure essence, emptiness, awareness, and the Sambhogakaya being innate, unimpeded luminosity, which is the great array of appearances of Dharmakaya. And then Nirmanakaya being the great pure appearance of awareness.
We actually do.
It sounded like that's where you were going at it.
Is another question? There's another question right there.
There's a history of the discussion of people
of people in the Christian tradition and early Christianity talking about the body not corrupting, that certain saints have reached states where the body did not corrupt, and it was sort of a goal. And then they tied the fall to the fact that we had to corrupt, and before that we did not. And I was wondering if it was just the difference between the Z factor and
You ask a very good question.
X factor. You know.
The question is, why do certain people, and it's not just Christians, it's in many traditions, it's happened to Hindus, it's happened in people in Judaism, it's happened to actually thousands of people. You can go into the Vatican and you can see incorrupt bodies. In a number of places in India, you can see incorrupt bodies. It's also happened to people in this country, among Native Americans, and in many places in Europe. What do you think causes that incorrupt state? Of the factors we just talked about, the X factor, the B factor, which one do you think causes that? It's X factor. Now, X factor can be generated. It's a dormant factor. Now, some people, when they generate this, their bodies begin to change. They develop healing ability. Their body begins to give off light. They begin to be able to float, for instance. They also begin to transform themselves, and because of the activity of this particular factor, people are often sainted. So what are some of the ways that this factor can be activated? Because one of the things that happens when you activate it, people become incorrupt. An incorrupt body is a body that doesn't decay normally. When I studied forensics, we had to study bodies in different forms of decay. And you can actually determine how long a person's been dead by the insects inside of that person at the time of your study. Certain insects come at particular times of decay. But an incorrupt body doesn't have that. There have been incorrupt bodies found in mud. And mud is one of the fastest ways people decay. Also, there have been incorrupt bodies found that have been hung in people that were crucified in the air. And the air is actually the fastest way that people decay. The air has more bacteria in it than the ground. Did everybody know that? So what are some of the ways that we might generate this X factor? Just if you think about it for a second. How does it come about? Yes.
Meditation or prayer?
That's right, meditation. And prayer. Anything else? Yes.
Through the breath, breathing techniques.
Well, let's call that meditation. There's a question over here.
Sacred sexuality? Sacred sexuality or tantra?
We can use tantra. They don't like to talk about tantra in the West because that's sex. But it is a path to enlightenment by using this factor. There's also one very powerful method we haven't mentioned yet.
Yoga?
Let's call yoga meditation. Tantra is also a form of yoga, but it's a very particular type of yoga. Yes, in the back. Chanting. What would you chant? What would you chant? You're close. Starts with an M, ends with a mantras. That's right. There's also another way to generate the X factor that we haven't talked about that you probably couldn't guess. Yes, maybe you could.
Under some type of crisis or stress that just happens, and then spontaneously something happens.
That's close, but not quite. Yes.
As far as technique or method or mode of delivery,
It's a mode of delivery.
well, Choigal is the only way I know of as far as rainbow body, but that's a technique of meditation, so that would just fall into meditation probably.
There's another way. What's the biggest source of energy in our solar system? The sun. That's your hint. It's not your answer. By
Light?
using light. Exactly. Let's call it solar yoga. It's not yoga, but let's call it solar yoga. There's a technique by which you can take in sunlight, using sunlight in combination with a very particular type of meditation to transform yourself and take advantage of the X factor. Now, just for a moment, let's talk about sunlight. Because it's not just light. Now, sometimes when you're doing research in spirituality, you might notice that most of the ancient cultures seem to worship the sun in some form. In ancient Rome and Greece, they had gods for the sun. In the Babylonian tradition, there were gods for the sun. In Christianity, Christ was associated with the sun. In Judaism, there was a form of meditation that's associated with sunlight, taking in sunlight. Even in China and India, there's a solar aspect to worship. There are a number of different aspects to sunlight that help us with the process of evolution, that can also help lead us to a better understanding of the spiritual world. There are things inside of sunlight spiritually that most of us don't know about. So let's talk about them. One thing that's inside of sunlight, obviously, is electromagnetic energy. We call that light. That's the easiest thing to sort of understand about sunlight. When you look at the sun is bright. It gives off energy. But that's just one of the things inside of the sun that is being generated by the sun. The sun also generates something called information factors. What's an information factor? An information factor is pure energy being generated by the sun that contains information about the creation of reality. It's not electromagnetic in nature. And we're going to talk about those factors in a little bit. But they're called information factors. Yes. We're trying to get all this on tape, so I apologize.
I've never heard of information factors. Where did that come from?
Okay. That's from a science called cursology. Anybody ever heard that term before? It comes from a combination of two words, cosmic and logos. And also, it's also called cosmic cursology or solar logos. So it's a combination of words that basically means information derived from the sun. Now, this is primarily information that has been passed down to us from the Gnostics. Has everyone heard of the Gnostics before? The Gnostics, especially the Essene Gnostic tradition, was a solar tradition, which essentially taught that human beings are derived from primordial beings that emanate from the sun, and that part of what controls our reality is an understanding of the higher forces that emanate from the sun and how the mind and the soul interact with them. So let's get back to the list of things inside sunlight. Another thing that's inside sunlight is called the evolutionary factor. The evolutionary factor was only added to sunlight by certain beings about 250,000 years ago. One of the reasons this factor was added, according to the teachings, is that human beings began to become somewhat lazy and cumbersome in their understanding of the universe. The evolutionary factor was added to make us curious about the universe. Another thing that's inside of the sun that doesn't really fit into our normal understanding of what comes from the sun are called mandalas, specifically divine mandala. Divine mandala are geometric forms. If you look at sunlight, one of the things you notice if you begin to look at it for a while is you begin to see geometric shapes. And these shapes don't really make any sense when you first begin to look at them. But there's been an exhaustive study of these shapes by a number of some of the deeper esoteric spiritual religions. And it shows that these shapes have a tremendous effect on the subconscious processes of the human mind. What do you think these shapes do? What's the purpose? Why would the universe, or why would the sun emanate this energy? Divine mandala in particular.
Is it a mandate, if you will, to get back in touch with the primordial source, basic ground?
That's good. That's close enough. Essentially, it's a way to guide us back toward enlightenment. It contains information in a very highly complex geometric form that leads the subconscious mind on sort of a journey through life so that people develop a hunger for reality, for understanding the deeper forces of reality. It's where our desire to know God comes from. There's one other force.
Okay, wait.
Yes.
I attended a very erudite conference on crop circles. Some MIT scientists were there.
Mm-hmm.
One guy had a theory. This is really exciting. Now you're talking about the geometric shapes. That he reproduced the flat crop circle by putting geometric shapes underneath a source of very powerful energy. It was, they don't know what, but the shapes placed that way underneath created the crop circle at the bottom.
So how do you think that happened? How do you think that happens?
It's in your theory, doesn't it?
Well, it's not my theory, actually.
This theory.
Yes.
Does it not? It fits in with the geometric shapes
Exactly.
you're speaking of.
But why does that happen?
It sounds like the crop circles were a sign of some kind.
Or they were stored inside of the energy so that under certain circumstances you can reproduce them. Actually, one of the things that composes the human body are these divine mandala. Each of us has stored inside of us certain mandala that once you master them will enable you to do things that look like miracles. They're not really miracles, but when you understand what the mandala does, you can control certain forces like gravity or the force of light or other forces in the universe that are connected to that particular mandala. That's a different study though. The fifth thing that's inside of it are universal forces. One of those universal forces is the X factor. All of that comes through sunlight. Early in my training, I didn't believe any of this. I didn't, like some of you probably look at that and say, well, that's not possible. Well, I've learned to say that impossible just takes a little bit of time. Because as we grow in our understanding of the universe, we begin to see that what we thought was impossible 100 years ago is sort of accomplished in a daily manner now. So let's look at the spiritual world and the path and to what we call physical is an understanding of the higher forces that emanate from the sun and how the mind and the soul interact with them. So let's get back to the list of things inside sunlight. Another thing that's inside sunlight is called the evolutionary factor. The evolutionary factor was only added to sunlight by certain beings about 250,000 years ago. One of the reasons this factor was added, according to the teachings, is that human beings began to become somewhat lazy and cumbersome in their understanding of the universe. The evolutionary factor was added to make us curious about the universe. Another thing that's inside of the sun that doesn't really fit into our normal understanding of what comes from the sun are called mandalas, specifically divine mandala. Divine mandala are geometric forms. If you look at sunlight, one of the things you notice if you begin to look at it for a while is you begin to see geometric shapes. And these shapes don't really make any sense when you first begin to look at them. But there's been an exhaustive study of these shapes by a number of some of the deeper esoteric spiritual religions. And it shows that these shapes have a tremendous effect on the subconscious processes of the human mind. What do you think these shapes do? What's the purpose? Why would the universe, or why would the sun emanate this energy? Divine mandala in particular.
Is it a mandate, if you will, to get back in touch with the primordial source, basic ground?
That's good. That's close enough. Essentially, it's a way to guide us back toward enlightenment. It contains information in a very highly complex geometric form that leads the subconscious mind on sort of a journey through life so that people develop a hunger for reality, for understanding the deeper forces of reality. It's where our desire to know God comes from. There's one other force.
Wait.
Yes.
I attended a very erudite conference on crop circles. Some MIT scientists were there.
Mm-hmm.
One guy had a theory. This is really exciting. Now you're talking about the geometric shapes. That he reproduced the flat crop circle by putting geometric shapes underneath a source of very powerful energy. It was, they don't know what, but the shapes placed that way underneath created the crop circle at the bottom.
So how do you think that happened? How do you think that happens?
It's in your theory, doesn't it?
Well, it's not my theory, actually.
This theory.
Yes.
Does it not? It fits in with the geometric shapes
Exactly.
you're speaking of.
But why does that happen?
It sounds like the crop circles were a sign of some kind.
Or they were stored inside of the energy so that under certain circumstances you can reproduce them. Actually, one of the things that composes the human body are these divine mandala. Each of us has stored inside of us certain mandala that once you master them will enable you to do things that look like miracles. They're not really miracles, but when you understand what the mandala does, you can control certain forces like gravity or the force of light or other forces in the universe that are connected to that particular mandala. That's a different study though. The fifth thing that's inside of it are universal forces. One of those universal forces is the X factor. All of that comes through sunlight. Early in my training, I didn't believe any of this. I didn't, like some of you probably look at that and say, well, that's not possible. Well, I've learned to say that impossible just takes a little bit of time. Because as we grow in our understanding of the universe, we begin to see that what we thought was impossible 100 years ago is sort of accomplished in a daily manner now. So let's look at the spiritual world and the path into what we call physical existence. The spiritual world starts from what we call the 99% world. Has everybody got this? Okay. Starts from what we call the 99% world, which is very similar to what Kabbalah teaches about there being a very evolved or much higher form of reality beyond our physical world from which all the other dimensions sort of derive. Our dimension is way down here, close to the 1% world, which is also something called null space, which is devoid of reality as we know it. It's a better way to look at that. It's not on this slide, though. Each of these dimensions, as you go down from the Godhead, or what we call the Creator, sort of devolves in complexity. So by the time you get to the fourth or the third dimension, reality is not quite as complex. Beings become subject to something we call death. So as we were talking about earlier, Christology is the science that we're talking about. It's a very ancient science that was propagated primarily by ancient Gnostics, primarily from the Essenes. Can I erase this now? Has everybody heard of the Essenes? The Essenes were a very, for lack of a better word, they were a very interesting group. And that's putting it very mildly. There are stories among the older ancient Essene cultures that they had a secret technique called the paradosis. Has anybody heard of that before? Okay. So the paradosis was a technique that involved taking in sunlight, among other things. And through the paradosis, one was able to transform themselves from a mortal being into an immortal being made of something other than physical matter. The paradosis was something that was only passed to the elder elect members of the Essenes, never to the women, which is sort of unusual, because if you're going to be immortal, why not have women around? But that's just me. So let's go over what these universal forces are. The paradosis takes into account one of these particular forces. In particular, takes into account the B factor, which we'll go over in a few minutes. These universal forces we're going to talk about, and I'm leaving one out on purpose. The A factor we're going to go over, the B factor we'll go over, X, Y, and Z factors. I'm leaving out the H factor because that's a factor that has to do with causing someone intentional harm. You can take advantage of that and learn about that when you're being trained in sort of the dark arts, but I don't train people or talk to people about that in particular. So let's talk about the factors one at a time. How are we doing on time? 20 minutes? Okay. The first factor, and I'm going over this a lot faster than I normally do, because we're condensing 2 days down into 3 hours. The first factor that we're going to talk about is called the A factor. And the A factor causes the propagation of self-propagation by which God is separated from himself and he disseminates himself throughout the universe. It's the first force that is taught in this science that is created. It's the first universal force that we have identified or that has been identified by the ancients. It's the first cause of emergence. One of my teachers was a Kabbalist, a very old Kabbalist, and I wondered just how old this guy was. But he told me a story about how the first force came into being, and I kind of like the story because it condenses it into something I could understand easily. He said, what if you knew a man who was extremely wealthy, and this man came to your home every day and said, I want to take you out to dinner and buy you things. And that might be cool the first time or two. And the next day, this man calls and said, I want to take you out to dinner and show you the town. After 3 or 4 times of doing that, most of us would start to get a little bit uncomfortable that this person was doing everything for us. And that ultimately, we would want to do some things for ourselves. So we would say, well, okay, if we go out to dinner today, let me pick up the check. And the man says, no, I insist. You can never pick up the check. It's always going to be me paying for everything. Well, most people eventually not want to go out with that man anymore. Why?
The matter of giving and receiving.
Because that's right. If in that relationship, you feel like you have no power. You're constantly being given to, even though that's great for a little bit, but you have no power. And so my teacher said that this is the way that humans in the beginning, in the primordial state, saw God. That God was primarily giving us everything we ever needed, and we never had to do anything. And so that some of us said, you know, I want to create my own apple pie. I want to create my own reality. I want to create my own everything so that I can feel the pleasure of giving things to myself. And so the first force was created by God as a way of pushing us into a universe where we could create things for ourselves. Now, some people like to say, well, I wasn't in that group. I didn't get consulted on that. But that's the way my teacher explained the propagation of the first force. It's a way to empower ourselves outside of the Godhead so that we could create reality and take advantage of it. We could work, we could get a wage, and give ourselves things that we needed. The next factor that came about is called the B factor. And the B factor is where the paradosis comes in. The A factor separates souls or spirits from God in the spiritual world. And it also caused death ultimately, because the ultimate separation from God is a form of death in a way. The B factor was created as a counteractant or a counteragent to the A factor. And in the B factor, there is an urge to reunite with the source of all creation, with the Creator himself. It is the force for spiritual evolution. In our higher levels of intelligence, B factor is extremely active. Now, in the ancient times, when the paradosis was taught, they would give the aspirant what they call the spiritual touch. And basically, they would touch you on the forehead. And the master would pass energy into the aspirant. And then the aspirant was given a mantra. But it wasn't really a mantra so much as it was a word. Now, in the Essene accounts of Jesus' baptism, it was essentially a paradosis or an event of the paradosis given by John the Baptist to Jesus himself. It's how Jesus was given the energy of divinity or higher divinity. And in the deeper mystery of that, Jesus was being initiated into a power that would later turn him into the Christ, the B factor, or the immortal factor, let's put it that way. It later immortalized him in a certain way. The X factor is another one of these forces that has a very specific job. The X factor is a force that takes the human form and is generated through there's two places the X factor comes from. It can come through all the areas we talked about, those 5 areas. It comes from the sun. Also, the earth generates a certain amount of X factor. And to be honest, the human body. Generates a certain amount of X factor. A friend of mine who is an astronomer at the University of Arizona talks about his research. And in his research, he did radio astronomy on the human body. If you look at the human body generates the same radiation as a star. So that radio telescopes had to be built far away from cities because human beings, when you point a radio telescope at a city, human beings light up like stars. We put out the same type of radiation. But one of these radiations is the X factor. It's very weak in most humans until they learn to bring it out more. This X factor has one focus, and that's to change the dormant 97% of human tissue into an immortal form. Now, there's a mantra that you can use, and this is a very ancient mantra. And this mantra is the embodiment of X factor. And the mantra will take X factor inside the human body, and if it's repeated under certain circumstances, 6,400,000 times, give or take 5 or 6 times, the human body transforms itself. Would you like to know what that mantra is? I've never had a group say no to that question. This is a J. Forgive my doctor's writing. It says Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Now this is a very ancient mantra. It's in Sanskrit, a form of Sanskrit. And the purpose of this mantra is several-fold. It slows down the aging process in humans. It also is called the immortal mantra. It energizes the X factor inside of humans. Also, it's a mantra that you can use with your solar meditation. Now, how do you think you might combine this mantra with your solar meditation? And my students can't say anything with this. You guys already know. How might you combine this mantra with solar meditation in order to accelerate the process of evolution?
Sit in the sun and say it.
That's close. That's very close. It does involve sitting in the sun. But what else?
The Buddhists use a prayer wheel. Can you put it on the prayer wheel and spin it? And
You sure could, but that's not what we're looking for. That's a good technique, though.
When you're sitting in the sun, you're just allowing the sun rays to penetrate you. So, I mean, you're opening yourself up and allowing the sun to go through you.
Let me give it to you. Has everybody got this? Yes. Om Ahum Vajra Guru. This is a U. I'm sorry. Pima Siddhi Hum. Guru. That's right. I'm sorry. Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Let me just give you a little bit of background about how you can apply this. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. I just said, can you imagine doing it 6.4 million times and have it be wrong?
Well, that's exactly. Oops, got to start over. I left out a word, I think. The sun doesn't always radiate the same kind of energy. First thing in the morning, from sunrise to approximately 1 hour afterwards, the sun is radiating primarily X factor. From 1 hour before sunset till after sunset, the sun radiates B factor and a little bit of X. In the hours intervening, the sun is radiating primarily Y factor and Z factor. which are very destructive factors. Yes.
Does that change during daylight savings time?
The time that the sun is going to come up is going to change depending on where you are. For instance, if you were in the Arctic, there are times of the year where the sun is almost always in sort of a low 1 hour away from sunrise or sunset position. Well, at those times, you're going to always be getting X and B. Or, yeah, X and B. Now, why am I giving you this? Well, for instance, if you're meditating first thing in the morning around sunrise, and the sun is emanating X factor, and you're saying this particular prayer, you're setting up a resonance between yourself and the sun. And you're setting up a pathway so that your body, instead of receiving a subconscious amount of X factor, you're going to start to receive many times more than the average person of X factor, so that you begin to accelerate the process of your own evolution. And this is actually a specific type of meditation where you get up first thing in the morning, you face the sun, and you don't just face it and sort of look at it with your eyes closed. There's a specific way to look at it. When you look at the sun first thing in the morning, sunlight's really different. Yes. Yes.
I have a question. Who's your teacher?
I've had several teachers.
I mean, in the Dzogchen tradition, who's your teacher?
It's not a Dzogchen teacher.
This is a
Talk
Dzogchen.
was my first teacher.
Well, what Tibetan Lama do you study with?
Wasn't a Tibetan Lama.
But this is a Dzogchen Ati Yoga practice you're talking about. And
it's
very
actually older than that.
Oh.
Much
okay.
older.
There are serious prohibitions about giving this practice.
Well, this
You do
isn't,
know
a
that.
this isn't a Dzogchen practice.
This is a Dzogchen practice.
But it's older than that.
Okay.
So this is well known outside the Dzogchen community.
You've not practiced with a Dzogchen master, right?
Not a Dzogchen master.
Are you a Buddhist?
I like Buddhism.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to be in my hot tub for the rising sun. Is that okay?
You got a cool house.
I do. Please come.
So, in this technique, there's a certain way to look at the sun. First thing you do is you imagine that the sun is a disk, like a clock. And each of these disks, well, each part of the disk can be separated into 4 parts. And so you begin saying your mantra, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum, at 12 o'clock. And you say it about this far, about 2 solar disk diameter away from the sun itself. And this is only at sunrise. Don't do this at midday when the sun is pretty bright. And at sunrise, the sun is not going to hurt your eyes. So you say it at each of these stations 5 seconds. So Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum, you can say it about 2 or 3 times at each station.
How's everybody doing today? So, for those of you who may not know who I am, which is probably the vast majority of you all, my name is Corday. I'm 24 years old. I was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, but was raised majority in Suitland, Maryland, which made me who I am today. I'm a hip hop artist, more specifically a Grammy-nominated hip hop artist.